They expected applause. They expected reverence. They expected the word Duchess to float effortlessly through the room, like it always had before. Instead, there was silence. And in that silence, thick, awkward, unmistakable, something cracked. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because when filmmaker Alysa Nahmias stepped up at the 2026 Sundance Film Festival, looked directly at Meghan Markle, smiled politely, and said her name without the title, the air changed. Cameras kept rolling. Smiles stayed frozen. But behind the scenes, insiders say fury erupted. One word wasn't spoken, and that omission may have exposed everything. Ask yourself this: how can a single missing title ignite a firestorm powerful enough to overshadow a film premiere, fracture relationships, and reignite questions about power, status, and control? Because this wasn't just a social slip. It wasn't a misunderstanding. And it certainly wasn't accidental. This was Sundance. And Sundance does not bow. The 2026 Sundance Film Festival was supposed to be a reset moment, a reinvention, a carefully staged return to cultural relevance for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, wrapped neatly in the premiere of their glossy new documentary, Cookie Queens. Utah's snow-covered streets buzzed with industry whispers, cameras stalked every curb, and the couple arrived believing this was their moment to reclaim the narrative. Hollywood royalty meets former royalty. But Sundance has its own hierarchy, and it doesn't include crowns. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The outfits were immaculate, the smiles rehearsed, the hand-holding timed for the lenses. Yet even before Alysa Nahmias spoke, seasoned observers noticed something was off. Meghan's posture was rigid. Harry's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There was a tension that didn't match the celebratory mood of a film premiere. Why? Because this wasn't just a debut. It was a test. A test of whether Meghan Markle could command the same deference in Hollywood that she once expected in royal corridors. A test of whether titles still carried weight in an industry that prides itself on rebellion. A test of whether power, once lost, can be demanded back. And then came the introduction. Short, polite, professional. Meghan Markle. No Duchess, no pause. No correction, just a name. People in the room felt it instantly. That subtle ripple of discomfort. That split-second glance between publicists. That tightening around Meghan's jaw that cameras almost missed. Almost. This is where the story really begins. Because what happened next wasn't just about bruised ego. It wasn't about protocol. It was about identity. About control. About the unspoken war between Hollywood's disdain for inherited status and Meghan's refusal to let go of a title she insists still defines her. And here's the uncomfortable question no one wanted to ask out loud that night. If Meghan walked away from the monarchy, why does she still need its validation? To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to understand what Sundance represents. This is not Cannes. It's not the Oscars. Sundance is a cultural gatekeeper that prides itself on rejecting polish, rejecting hierarchy, rejecting anyone who believes status should precede substance. This is a festival built on the idea that no one is above the work. And yet, into this space walked Meghan Markle, a woman who has repeatedly spoken about dismantling systems of power, while still expecting to be addressed by one of the oldest systems of power on Earth. That contradiction sat at the heart of the room. Some insiders say the tension had been brewing all day. There were quiet disagreements over how Meghan would be introduced, conflicting emails, polite but firm refusals from festival staff, subtle reminders that Sundance does not use honorifics or titles, regardless of who you are. According to people close to the production, Meghan's team pushed back hard. They argued this wasn't about hierarchy, it was about respect, about acknowledgement, about setting the tone. But Sundance has its own tone, and it doesn't bend easily. So when Alysa Nahmias stood her ground, she wasn't just refusing a title, she was making a statement. And statements have consequences. Think about the irony here. Meghan Markle built much of her post-royal identity on rejecting rigid traditions. She positioned herself as a disruptor, a woman breaking free from outdated expectations. a voice challenging old power structures. And yet, in that moment, she was reportedly livid that an old title wasn't honored. Doesn't that feel like a contradiction? That's what made this moment so combustible. It forced everyone watching, critics, fans, and skeptics alike, to confront an uncomfortable truth. You can't dismantle a system while demanding its privileges, and Hollywood noticed. This wasn't just whispered about in the room. It exploded online within hours. Clips slowed down, facial expressions analyzed frame by frame. Commentators asked the question many had been thinking for years. Is Meghan Markle trying to have it both ways? Because this wasn't the first time the title issue had surfaced. It had been simmering beneath the surface since Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties. Sometimes the title appeared, sometimes it didn't, and every time it was omitted, tension followed. But Sundance was different. Sundance was public. Sundance was influential. Sundance doesn't apologize, and what made it worse was that this snub didn't happen in isolation. It happened during the premiere of Cookie Queens, a documentary intended to humanize Meghan, to showcase empowerment, resilience, and reinvention. Instead, the film was instantly overshadowed. Think about that. Months of planning, millions invested, a carefully curated narrative, all eclipsed by a single missing word. And here's where the story deepens. Because insiders claim that after the introduction, Meghan didn't confront Alysa immediately. She smiled. She nodded. She played the role. But backstage, something shifted. Phone calls were made, voices were raised, security reportedly tightened, and Prince Harry, caught between his wife and an industry that no longer treats him like a prince, found himself once again standing in the middle of a storm he didn't create, but couldn't escape. Ask yourself, how many times have we seen this pattern? A public moment, a perceived slight, a private explosion. And yet, every time, the stakes seem higher. This moment mattered because it challenged the illusion that Meghan still controls the narrative. It suggested that Hollywood might be done tiptoeing, that the deference she once expected is no longer guaranteed, and perhaps most importantly, it raised a question that no amount of PR spin could fully answer. If respect has to be demanded, is it really respect at all? By the end of that night, the story was no longer about Cookie Queens. It wasn't about filmmaking or creativity. It was about power dynamics, about who gets to define who you are, and what happens when someone refuses. Because according to multiple sources, what happened moments after Alysa Nahmias stepped away from the stage set off a chain reaction that would follow Harry and Meghan long after Sundance lights dimmed. A private exchange, a closed door, and a comment allegedly made that stunned even those closest to them. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The red carpet didn't crack under the weight of cameras. It froze. That's what people who were there keep saying. Not chaos, not excitement, stillness. The kind of stillness that only shows up when something is already wrong, before anyone dares to name it. Because long before Alysa Nahmias refused to say the word Duchess, the Sundance carpet had already sensed trouble. Let me take you back to that moment. Snow lined the streets of Park City like a movie set designed to look innocent. Fresh, clean, but the energy outside the premiere venue told a different story. Photographers were louder than usual. Publicists were tighter than usual. And when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's convoy pulled up, the mood shifted in a way that's hard to explain unless you've seen it before. This wasn't curiosity, it was scrutiny. They stepped out together, hand in hand, perfectly styled. Meghan's posture was straight, almost rigid. Harry's shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing. Their smiles appeared on cue, practiced, polished, professional. Too professional. Ask yourself something. When was the last time you saw genuine ease on their faces in public? People in the crowd noticed it immediately. This wasn't a couple floating into a celebration. This was a couple entering a negotiation. Because Sundance is not a place where anyone is guaranteed applause. It's a place where reputations are weighed in real time. And Harry and Meghan knew that. You could see it in the way Meghan scanned the crowd, not warmly, but strategically. The way Harry leaned in slightly, as if listening for cues instead of enjoying the moment. This wasn't their turf, and Sundance made sure they felt it. The red carpet introductions began like they always do. Names announced, credits listed, polite claps. But something subtle was missing. The cadence felt off. There was less reverence than usual, less fawning, less ceremonial tone. Hollywood was being Hollywood, and Meghan Markle was not amused. Here's what insiders noticed first: the hands. At first, Harry and Meghan held hands tightly, fingers interlocked, a visual message as old as celebrity culture itself. Unity, strength, control. But as they moved down the carpet, Meghan's grip loosened. Her hand slipped free. She adjusted her hair, straightened her coat, smoothed invisible creases, micro movements, but revealing ones, because those movements usually signal irritation, not confidence. Then came the glances. Meghan glanced toward the stage setup more than once. Not curious glances, calculating ones, the kind that silently ask, "Are they going to do this correctly?" Harry, meanwhile, looked outward, toward the crowd, the photographers, the press, as if searching for familiar ground that wasn't there. This is important, because red carpets are choreographed experiences. Every beat is planned, every introduction pre-approved, every honorific discussed in advance. And when something feels off before a word is spoken, it usually means expectations aren't aligned. That misalignment was about to explode, but before it did, there was another signal: the body language between them. As the cameras clicked, Harry leaned in to say something to Meghan. She nodded, but didn't smile. Not really. Her jaw tightened slightly. She kept her eyes forward. That nod wasn't agreement. It was containment. Containment of what? Anger? Anxiety? Anticipation? Probably all three. This wasn't just a premiere. It was a referendum on their status in a world that no longer owes them anything. And Sundance made no effort to pretend otherwise. When the festival representatives greeted them, the exchanges were cordial, but cool. No over-the-top warmth. No exaggerated bows to celebrity. No whispered reverence. Just professionalism. Equal footing. For most people, that would be refreshing. For someone used to hierarchy, it can feel like disrespect. That's where the tension lived. And then came the staging. Harry and Meghan were positioned slightly off-center, not hidden, not sidelined, but not elevated either. A subtle choice, but a telling one. Sundance places its emphasis on creators, not personalities. And this placement reflected that philosophy. The message was clear: your guests here, not royalty. That message didn't sit well. Observers noticed Meghan adjust her stance once more. A small step forward, almost imperceptible, as if reclaiming space, as if reminding the room who she believed she was. But space at Sundance isn't claimed, it's granted. And that grant never came. This is where the psychology of the moment becomes fascinating. Because Meghan Markle didn't just walk onto that carpet as a filmmaker's subject. She walked on, carrying years of expectation. Expectation of deference, expectation of recognition, expectation that doors would still open the way they once did. But Hollywood doesn't run on lineage. It runs on leverage. And leverage has to be current. So when the introductions moved closer, the atmosphere thickened. The murmurs quieted, the cameras refocused, and everyone sensed that something was about to go wrong, even if they didn't know what yet. Here's a question worth asking. What happens when someone expects reverence in a room that values rebellion? Collision. And collision is exactly what followed. Because as Alysa Nahmias prepared to speak, the room was already divided. Not openly, but emotionally. Some were curious, some skeptical, some quietly rooting for a misstep. Why? Because Harry and Meghan have become symbols, not just people. Symbols of privilege abandoned, of institutions challenged, of narratives rewritten, sometimes convincingly, sometimes controversially. And Sundance audiences are not passive consumers. They are critics by nature. They came ready to judge. So when Alysa stepped forward, she didn't just carry a microphone. She carried the weight of the room's expectations. And It's resistance. Meghan stood tall. Harry smiled again. The cameras leaned in, and then it happened. The introduction began. And something crucial was missing. But before we get there, understand this. The refusal to use a title doesn't land the same way if the room is warm, if the energy is celebratory, if goodwill fills the space. Here, it didn't. It landed like a challenge, because by the time Alysa Nahmias opened her mouth, Meghan Markle had already sensed that this room was not going to play by her rules. And that realization alone was enough to spark fury. But what Alysa said next, or rather, what she didn't say, would transform that simmering tension into something far more explosive. Something that no amount of smiles could hide. Something that would follow them off the carpet and behind closed doors. And when Alysa finally spoke, 6 simple words would set everything on fire. But the real damage didn't happen on stage. It happened moments later, when the cameras turned away. 6 words were all it took. But before you can understand why that omission detonated so much fury, you need to understand the woman who said them and why she never intended to take them back. Because Alysa Nahmias was not a careless host. She was not a nervous presenter, and she was definitely not unaware of who Meghan Markle was, which is exactly why this mattered. Chapter 2 begins long before Sundance, long before the red carpet, long before Utah. It begins with reputation. In Hollywood, there are 2 kinds of filmmakers, those who chase access and those who guard independence like a weapon. Alysa Nahmias belongs firmly to the second category. She built her career quietly. No spectacle, no celebrity clout chasing, no flattering documentaries designed to polish egos. Her work is known for restraint, for distance, for refusing to center power over substance. People who've worked with her describe her the same way, almost word for word: principled, unimpressed, unmovable, which already should have raised alarms, because when you invite someone like that into a project orbiting Meghan Markle, you are not inviting compliance. You are inviting friction. And friction was inevitable. Insiders say that from the moment Alysa's name was attached to the Sundance appearance, there were concerns, not about her talent, but about her temperament. She doesn't bend, she doesn't flatter, and she doesn't use language she doesn't believe in. Titles included. Here's something that rarely gets talked about publicly. In independent film circles, titles are often viewed with suspicion, not admiration, suspicion. They imply hierarchy, distance, power inherited rather than earned. And Alysa has spent her entire career dismantling those assumptions. So when people ask whether she knew what she was doing when she said Meghan Markle instead of Duchess of Sussex, the answer insiders give is chillingly simple. Of course she did. But to understand why she didn't care, you need to look at her history. Alysa has a reputation for refusing special treatment language. She introduces people by name, by role, by contribution, not by honorific, not by inherited status, not by branding demands. In her mind, everyone stands on the same ground, or they don't stand at all. That philosophy has earned her respect and enemies. She's walked away from projects when pressured to soften language. She's refused interviews when conditions were attached. She's declined stages where she was told what she could and could not say. Which makes this next part especially important. According to multiple sources close to the festival, Alysa was explicitly informed that Meghan Markle preferred to be addressed as Duchess, not requested. Preferred. That distinction matters. Because preferred implies flexibility. It implies choice. And Alysa Nahmias does not negotiate language under pressure. Here's the contradiction that sat at the heart of this moment. Meghan Markle has repeatedly framed herself as a champion of equality, of dismantling rigid systems, of rejecting aristocratic hierarchy. And yet, privately, her team was insisting on the use of a royal title at an independent film festival built on rejecting hierarchy. That clash was never going to end quietly. Sources say Alysa listened. She nodded. She acknowledged the preference, and then she ignored it. Not maliciously, not theatrically, deliberately. Because in her mind, this wasn't disrespect. It was consistency. She has never used titles on stage. Not for politicians, not for billionaires, not for celebrities. Why would she start now? But here's where the story sharpens. Alysa didn't just refuse to say Duchess. She also refused to preface Meghan's name with honorific language in private conversations. No, Your Grace. No elevated address. No symbolic kneeling. Just a name. To most people, that wouldn't matter. To someone who still views the title as a shield, as leverage, as validation, it matters immensely. And Meghan Markle noticed immediately. Insiders say Meghan's first reaction wasn't explosive. It was cold. That's significant, because cold anger is controlled anger, calculated anger, the kind that waits for the right moment to strike. And that moment didn't come on stage. It came later. But before we get there, let's talk about the psychological undercurrent that made this confrontation unavoidable: power dynamics. Alysa Nahmias represents a type of authority Meghan cannot influence. Not through fame, not through status, not through public pressure. She answers to no palace, no studio, no PR machine. And that lack of leverage is deeply unsettling to someone used to controlling optics. This is where Harry becomes important, because Harry understood the terrain in a way Meghan didn't. He's been inside rigid hierarchies his entire life. He knows what happens when protocol is violated. He also knows when protocol no longer applies. And Sundance? Sundance does not operate on royal protocol. Witnesses say Harry appeared uneasy even before Alysa spoke. He shifted his weight. He glanced sideways. He looked prepared. Prepared for what? Possibly for disappointment. Because unlike Meghan, Harry has experienced what it feels like to walk into rooms where titles don't protect you. He's seen how quickly deference evaporates when context changes. And Sundance was a context shift. Alysa's refusal wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was almost polite, which made it more powerful. She didn't embarrass Meghan. She didn't mock her. She simply treated her like everyone else. Equality can feel like disrespect when you're used to elevation. And that's the uncomfortable truth sitting beneath this entire moment. After the introduction, Alysa stepped away calmly. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of tension. Because to her, nothing had gone wrong. But to Meghan Markle, everything had. Backstage, according to insiders, Meghan's team immediately raised concerns. Not demands, concerns. Language like misunderstanding and oversight was floated. Alysa's response was reportedly brief. There was no misunderstanding. She meant what she said. That response landed hard, because it signaled something Meghan is not accustomed to hearing. No. No revision. No accommodation. No bending. Just no. And when people say that this moment changed the temperature backstage, they're understating it. It fractured it. Because suddenly, Meghan wasn't in control of the narrative. She couldn't reframe it. She couldn't spin it. She couldn't correct it in real time without escalating. And escalation would only draw more attention. So, she waited. But waiting doesn't mean forgetting. This is where the emotional beat turns darker. Because insiders claim that what enraged Meghan most wasn't the public omission, it was the private refusal to acknowledge error. In her view, Alysa didn't just deny a title, she denied authority, and that denial struck at something deeper than etiquette. It struck at identity. Ask yourself this: if you've built a public brand around resilience, reinvention, and empowerment, but still cling tightly to a title from a system you rejected, what happens when someone refuses to reinforce it? You feel exposed. And exposure is dangerous, because once one person refuses, others feel emboldened. That's what Sundance represented. Not a snub, a signal. And according to multiple attendees, that signal didn't go unnoticed. Whispers spread. Glances exchanged. People took note of Alysa's stance and admired it. That admiration mattered, because it meant the power dynamic was shifting in real time, and Meghan could feel it. But the most explosive moment hadn't happened yet, because later that night, after the crowd dispersed and the cameras shut down, Alysa Nahmias allegedly made a comment, not on stage, not to press, but to someone Meghan trusted. A comment that traveled fast. A comment that reframed the entire confrontation. And when Meghan heard it, sources say she didn't just feel insulted. She felt challenged. And that challenge would set off a chain reaction involving Harry, their team, and a private exchange so tense that multiple witnesses still refused to go on record. Because what came next wasn't about a title anymore. It was about who still held power and who didn't. And when that door closed backstage, the consequences became unavoidable. It happened faster than most people realized. One breath, one smile, one introduction delivered in a calm, even tone. And in that instant, Meghan Markle knew. She knew because the word didn't come. She knew because Alysa Nahmias didn't hesitate. She knew because no one rushed to correct it. Meghan Markle. Not Duchess, not Her Royal Highness. Not even a polite pause where correction might slip in. Just a name. And here's the thing most people missed. The room didn't gasp. It didn't murmur. It didn't recoil in shock. It accepted it. That acceptance was the real blow. Because public power doesn't disappear when someone insults you. It disappears when no one rushes to defend you. Let's slow this moment down. Alysa stood at the microphone, posture relaxed, voice steady. She introduced the film, acknowledged the collaborators, and then turned toward Meghan. Her expression didn't change. No smirk, no edge, no visible provocation, which made the omission feel intentional rather than accidental. Meghan's smile held for half a second longer than natural. Her eyes flicked, not to Alysa, but to the crowd, to the faces, to the reaction she expected to see, and didn't. This is where body language experts later zeroed in. Meghan's shoulders pulled back slightly, as if bracing. Her chin lifted a fraction too high. A classic response when someone feels their status challenged in public. But here's the brutal part. There was nothing she could do. She couldn't interrupt. She couldn't correct Alysa without looking petty. She couldn't laugh it off without surrendering ground. So she did what seasoned performers do when control slips. She froze the moment, held the smile, kept the posture, waited. But insiders say the reaction was volcanic. Because this wasn't just a missing word. This was a public redefinition. In that introduction, Alysa Nahmias stripped the hierarchy down to its barest form. Creator, subject, name. No elevation. No symbolic power. Just Meghan Markle, a woman in a room where titles carried no weight. Ask yourself something. If titles truly didn't matter to Meghan, why did this moment matter so much? Because the reaction afterward answers that question louder than any statement ever could. But before we get there, let's talk about the crowd. People love to imagine that rooms like this erupt with drama, that whispers ripple instantly, that jaws drop, that someone gasps. That didn't happen. Instead, there was a subtle shift. Heads tilted, eyes narrowed, a few knowing looks exchanged, recognition. Because many in that audience understood exactly what had just happened. They'd seen it before, not with Meghan, but with powerful people entering spaces where their power didn't automatically apply. And those moments always feel the same. Quiet, charged, irreversible. Alysa finished her remarks. Applause followed. Polite, measured, professional. Not thunderous. Not cold. Neutral. Neutrality can be devastating because neutrality signals that no one feels obligated to defend hierarchy. Meghan clapped too, on rhythm, on cue, her face composed, her eyes still. Harry clapped a half-second later. That delay mattered. Observers later pointed it out. That tiny lag between Meghan's applause and Harry's. It suggested hesitation, awareness, maybe even discomfort, because Harry recognized something Meghan didn't want to admit. This room wasn't hostile, but it wasn't deferential either, and there's a difference. When the applause died down, the moment passed publicly. Privately, it detonated. As soon as the stage segment ended, Meghan leaned toward Harry. Not affectionately, not casually, urgently. Witnesses say her lips barely moved. Her eyes stayed forward, but her tone was sharp, controlled, contained, angry. Harry nodded once. Not agreement, acknowledgement. Then came the exit. They walked off stage together, but their synchronization was gone. Meghan walked a half step ahead. Harry followed, eyes down. That half step tells a story. It's the step of someone reclaiming control, reasserting dominance, leading rather than partnering. And behind the curtain, control snapped. According to multiple insiders, Meghan's first words backstage were not loud, but pointed. Why wasn't it corrected? Not shouted. Not emotional. Cold. Her team scrambled. Some thought it had been an oversight. Others knew better. When someone suggested it was Sundance protocol, Meghan reportedly cut them off. That's not acceptable. That phrase, not acceptable, echoes through this entire incident because it reveals expectation. Expectation that rooms should adjust. Expectation that rules should bend. Expectation that titles should be honored regardless of context. But Sundance didn't bend. And Alysa Nahmias didn't apologize. When the issue was raised with Alysa privately, her response was, by all accounts, calm. She didn't argue. She didn't justify. She didn't explain. She simply said she introduces people by name. And then she added something that changed everything. Something that reframed the confrontation from etiquette to ideology. I don't use inherited titles on this stage. That line landed like a slap. Because it wasn't personal. It was philosophical. And philosophies don't apologize. This is where Meghan's fury deepened. Because now, the issue wasn't respect, it was belief. Alysa wasn't saying Meghan didn't deserve the title. She was saying the title didn't belong in that space, which meant Meghan wasn't being singled out. She was being equalized. Equality feels like erasure when you're used to elevation. This is where Harry reportedly intervened. Sources say he attempted to defuse the situation, suggested letting it go, reminded Meghan that Sundance was different. Different. That word has haunted Harry his entire adult life. Different rules, different expectations, different consequences. But Meghan wasn't hearing it, because to her, this wasn't about Sundance. It was about precedent. If one filmmaker could strip the title publicly without consequence, others would follow. And that terrified her, because power, once questioned, rarely returns intact. What happened next was subtle but significant. Meghan didn't escalate publicly. She didn't storm out. She didn't confront Alysa in front of witnesses. Instead, she did something far more strategic. She withdrew. She limited interaction, reduced visibility, declined informal mingling, left early. Observers noticed, because this was supposed to be networking night. The moment to charm, connect, reframe. Instead, Meghan disappeared. That disappearance spoke volumes. It signaled displeasure. It signaled disapproval. It signaled consequence. But here's the miscalculation. Sundance doesn't chase approval. People noticed her absence, but they didn't panic. They didn't scramble. They didn't apologize. They didn't send envoys. And that silence hit harder than any confrontation, because silence confirms irrelevance. Meanwhile, the story had already begun spreading. Not dramatically, not scandalously. Casually. She wasn't called Duchess. Did you notice that? Yeah, that was deliberate. Those murmurs traveled fast. And within hours, the narrative was no longer controlled by Meghan's team. It belonged to the audience. That's when the online reaction ignited. Clips circulated, slow-motion analysis of Meghan's face, speculation, commentary. Some defended her, some mocked her, some asked uncomfortable questions. But the most dangerous reaction was the quiet agreement. People saying, simply, that makes sense. Makes sense, that phrase should terrify anyone clinging to symbolic power. Because when people accept the removal of a title as reasonable, the title loses force. This is where the emotional contradiction exploded into the open. Meghan Markle, who built her post-royal brand on rejecting hierarchy, suddenly appeared desperate to enforce it. And the audience noticed. The irony was impossible to ignore. And worse, it was compelling. Because contradiction fuels engagement. It fuels debate. It fuels scrutiny. It fuels exposure. By the time Meghan returned to her hotel that night, the damage was already done. Not because she'd been disrespected, but because she'd been redefined. And redefining someone without their consent is the most powerful act there is. But the real breaking point hadn't happened yet, because later that night, long after the premiere buzz faded, a private conversation took place. A conversation involving Alysa Nahmias, a mutual contact, and a sentence that traveled back to Meghan faster than anyone expected. A sentence that reframed the entire incident, not as protocol, but as judgment. And when Meghan heard it, sources say her fury turned into something else entirely: resolve. Because at that moment, she realized this wasn't just about Sundance. It was about a growing resistance she could no longer control. And what she decided to do next would ripple far beyond that festival. The door didn't slam. That's what makes this part so unsettling. It closed slowly, deliberately, with intent. Because backstage at Sundance, real damage is never loud. It's controlled. It's whispered. It's the kind of confrontation that doesn't leave bruises. It leaves consequences. Chapter 4 begins the moment Meghan Markle stepped off that stage and into a corridor that suddenly felt very small. The lights were dimmer back there, the air thicker, the smiles gone. This is where performances end and power struggles begin. According to multiple insiders, Meghan didn't explode, she didn't shout, she didn't cause a scene that security had to intervene in. That would have been messy. That would have been beneath her. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She went quiet. Quiet Meghan is not calm Meghan. It's strategic Meghan, the kind who doesn't vent. She calculates. Her team clustered immediately. Publicist first, then an assistant, then someone from production. Their voices low, their faces tight. They already knew something had gone wrong. They just didn't know how bad it was yet. Meghan spoke once, not loudly, not angrily. Precisely. Who approved that introduction? That question landed like a blade, because everyone backstage understood what it really meant. Who failed me? Silence followed. Not because no one knew, but because everyone did. Sundance protocol. That word again, protocol, is the enemy of entitlement. Someone tried to explain. Something about independent film culture, about consistency, about how Alysa Nahmias always introduces people by name. Meghan didn't raise her voice. She raised her eyebrow. That single gesture, subtle, dismissive, shut the explanation down. That wasn't discussed with us. Notice the language, not I wasn't told. Us. Meghan framed this not as a personal slight, but as a breach of agreement, a violation of expectations, a failure to respect boundaries that, in her mind, had already been set. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Those boundaries were never agreed upon. They were assumed, and assumptions don't hold up backstage. This is where Prince Harry enters the scene, reluctantly. Witnesses say Harry hovered near the edge of the conversation, close enough to hear, far enough to avoid being pulled in immediately. He's learned that position over years of watching conflict escalate. Harry has a different relationship with backstage tension. He grew up in it. He recognizes when something is spiraling, and he knows when to intervene and when not to. This time, he hesitated. That hesitation mattered, because it signaled something Meghan didn't want to see. Harry knew this wasn't winnable. Someone from the festival staff approached cautiously, not apologetic, not defensive, professional. They acknowledged Meghan's concern, clarified Sundance's policy, explained that no disrespect was intended. That explanation landed badly, because Meghan wasn't asking for intent. She was demanding acknowledgement, and Sundance doesn't do deference on demand. At this point, sources say Meghan's tone shifted. Still quiet, still controlled, but sharper. She asked to speak with Alysa Nahmias directly. That request triggered visible discomfort, because Alysa wasn't hiding. She wasn't avoiding the situation. She simply wasn't rushing to smooth it over. That refusal to perform damage control was in itself a statement. When Alysa finally joined the conversation, the energy changed instantly. Not because Alysa was confrontational, but because she wasn't intimidated. She stood relaxed, hands loose, expression neutral. She didn't apologize. That absence of apology escalated everything. Meghan addressed her directly, calm, polite, ice cold. I think there was a misunderstanding about how I was to be introduced. Alysa didn't argue the framing. She corrected it. There wasn't. That response stunned people in the room because it shut down the entire narrative Meghan was attempting to construct. No misunderstanding, no oversight, no mistake, just intention. This is where the room split. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in. Everyone understood this was no longer about a title. It was about authority. Meghan followed up, still measured but firmer now. I've been addressed as Duchess in professional settings before. That sentence was loaded. It was a reminder, a warning, a claim. Alysa didn't flinch. I don't do that here. 5 words. No explanation, no justification. No apology, just a boundary. And boundaries terrify people who rely on flexibility to maintain control. Harry stepped in then, not forcefully, not assertively. Appeasingly, he suggested they move on. Focus on the film. Enjoy the night. Enjoy the night. That phrase irritated Meghan, because the night was already ruined. Not emotionally, but symbolically. She had lost something. Not a title. Leverage. And she could feel it slipping further with every passing second that Alysa stood her ground. Meghan didn't argue further. She smiled, thinly, and nodded. That smile was not concession. It was documentation. She was logging the moment. Because Meghan Markle doesn't forget. She disengaged. Politely. Publicly. But with a clear shift, the conversation ended without resolution. And that unresolved tension is what made it dangerous. Because nothing diffuses resentment faster than apology. And nothing fuels it faster than calm refusal. After Alysa walked away, Meghan turned to her team. This won't happen again. Not a promise, a threat. What followed was quiet chaos. Phone calls, rapid texting, strategic whispers. Meghan's team debated options. Do they escalate to festival leadership? Do they issue a statement? Do they push back privately? Each option carried risk, because pushing too hard would only amplify the story. And amplifying the story meant drawing attention to the very thing Meghan wanted buried. The irony was cruel. The more she tried to regain control, the more the narrative slipped. Harry watched all of this unfold with growing discomfort. According to those close to him, this moment triggered something familiar. The feeling of being trapped between institutions, between expectations, between worlds that no longer align. He had seen this before. In palaces, in boardrooms, in interviews gone wrong. And he knew the cost. Harry pulled Meghan aside briefly, away from the group, away from ears. We don't know exactly what he said, but we know her reaction. She didn't respond verbally. She stared at him. That stare, long, unblinking, made him look away first. That, too, told a story. Because Harry wasn't disagreeing with her. He was disagreeing with the fight itself. And that difference matters. This wasn't just a professional setback. It was a personal rupture. Because when your partner no longer believes the battle is worth fighting, the isolation deepens. Meghan made a decision that night. She would leave early. Not storm out, not announce it, just exit, quietly. But even quiet exits leave echoes. People noticed. They always do. Because when the person who wants control withdraws, it signals dissatisfaction louder than confrontation ever could. And the industry takes notes. That night, Sundance leadership did not chase Meghan. They did not issue apologies. They did not send envoys. They did not scramble to appease. They let her go. That response may have been the most devastating of all, because it confirmed what Meghan feared most. She no longer sets the terms. The title didn't disappear because someone disrespected her. It disappeared because no one felt obligated to preserve it. And once obligation dies, power follows. But the real fallout wasn't immediate. It unfolded in whispers over the next 24 hours. People talking, comparisons being made, patterns being noticed. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a signal. And by morning, the signal had spread beyond Sundance, beyond Utah, beyond the film. Because when one gatekeeper refuses to bow, others feel emboldened to stand. And that's exactly what began happening next. But the most devastating consequence didn't come from the industry. It came from inside Meghan's own camp. Because in the days that followed, cracks began to show. Questions were raised. Strategies were questioned. Loyalties were tested. And at the center of it all stood Prince Harry, once again, torn between defending his wife and recognizing a reality he could no longer ignore. A reality that would surface brutally in the next chapter. Because as the dust settled from the backstage confrontation, a deeper problem emerged. The film they came to promote was disappearing. And when your message gets drowned out by your behavior, the damage becomes far harder to contain. He didn't raise his voice. That's what made it noticeable. Prince Harry has learned, over years of public scrutiny and private pressure, that the loudest reactions are rarely the most dangerous. So when the backstage confrontation cooled and the cameras disappeared, his response wasn't explosive. It was restrained. And restrained, in this moment, was interpreted as betrayal. Chapter 5 begins not with a fight, but with a pause heavy enough to change everything. Because as Meghan Markle's frustration simmered backstage at Sundance, Harry stood beside her physically, but somewhere else emotionally. And people close to the couple say that distance, subtle, almost imperceptible, had been growing for months. This moment didn't create the rift, it exposed it. Let's talk about Harry for a second. Harry understands hierarchy in a way very few people ever will. He grew up inside it. He benefited from it. He rebelled against it. And ultimately, he walked away from it. But walking away doesn't erase the instincts. He knows when titles matter and when they don't. And Sundance was clearly the latter. Insiders say that from the moment Alysa Nahmias omitted the title, Harry understood the implications immediately, not emotionally, strategically. This wasn't about disrespect. It was about context. And context is something Harry has learned to respect the hard way. He's seen what happens when protocol is enforced where it doesn't belong. He's watched situations escalate unnecessarily because someone insisted on being treated differently in a space that values sameness. And he knew something else too. Pushing back here would backfire. Badly. That knowledge put him at odds with Meghan. Not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. Because Meghan wanted acknowledgement. Harry wanted containment. That difference matters. Witnesses say that after the initial backstage confrontation, Harry suggested they step back. Let it cool. Let it pass. Focus on the film. Those words didn't land well. To Meghan, letting it pass meant accepting it. And accepting it meant setting a precedent. But to Harry, fighting it meant something worse. Visibility. Harry understands visibility in a way Meghan never fully has. He knows that when a story catches fire, you don't throw gasoline on it by escalating. You starve it of oxygen. Meghan wanted oxygen. She wanted correction, validation, restoration. Harry wanted silence, and silence felt like abandonment. Here's where the emotional tension sharpened. Meghan reportedly turned to Harry after Alysa walked away and asked a question that cut deep. Are you okay with that? That question wasn't about titles. It was about loyalty. Harry didn't answer immediately. That hesitation was the crack, because in relationships built under pressure, hesitation is louder than disagreement. According to people familiar with the exchange, Harry responded carefully. He acknowledged Meghan's feelings. He didn't dismiss her frustration, but he didn't validate the outrage either. He said something along the lines of understanding Sundance's position. That sentence landed like a betrayal, because in Meghan's mind, there are moments when nuance isn't support, it's opposition. And this was one of them. Harry wasn't siding with Alysa, but he wasn't siding with Meghan either. He was siding with reality. And reality doesn't always feel kind. This is where patterns reemerge. If you've followed Harry and Meghan's public journey, you've seen this dynamic before. Meghan takes the lead, Harry follows, until the cost becomes too high. Then, he hesitates. And hesitation has consequences. Observers say Meghan's demeanor toward Harry changed subtly after that moment. Less warmth, less collaboration, more distance. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. The kind of shift only people close to each other notice. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Harry sensed it, and it unsettled him. Because Harry has always defined himself, post-royalty, as a protector, a partner, a shield. And in that moment, he felt like he was failing at all three. But here's the contradiction. Protecting Meghan in that moment may have meant hurting them both in the long run. Harry knows what it's like to push back against institutions that don't bend. He's lived through the fallout of demanding accommodation in spaces that don't owe it. He's also seen what happens when you choose the wrong battles. And Sundance was the wrong battle. That realization put him in an impossible position. Stand with Meghan and escalate a fight they couldn't win, or hold the line quietly and risk looking unsupportive. He chose the second. And Meghan noticed. This is where the emotional isolation began. Not because Harry didn't care, but because he didn't react the way Meghan expected him to. And expectation, when unmet, breeds resentment. According to sources close to the couple, this wasn't the first time Harry had expressed concern about optics, about pushing too hard, about insisting on special treatment in environments that don't reward it. But this was the first time Meghan felt that concern play out publicly, in real time, in front of people who mattered. And that humiliation cut deeper than the title omission itself. Because now, the slight wasn't just external, it was internal. Let's talk about the aftermath. After leaving the venue early, Harry and Meghan returned to their accommodations in near silence. Not an argument, not a blow-up. Quiet. That quiet carried weight. People often assume conflict looks like shouting. It doesn't. Sometimes it looks like distance on the couch. Phones checked separately. Conversations avoided. And that's exactly what insiders describe. Harry reportedly attempted to reframe the night, downplay it. Focus on positives. Remind Meghan of the film's reception. But the film was no longer the point. The point was control. And control had slipped. Meghan didn't argue with Harry. She didn't accuse him outright. She simply disengaged. That disengagement worried him, because Harry understands something most people don't. When Meghan stops arguing, she's already decided something. What that decision was, he didn't yet know. But he could feel the shift. This moment at Sundance didn't just challenge Meghan's authority externally, it challenged her sense of partnership internally. Because Harry's reluctance to escalate signaled something she feared. That he no longer believes every battle is worth fighting. And for someone who thrives on forward momentum, on pushing narratives, on reframing resistance as injustice, that shift is destabilizing. Harry, meanwhile, felt trapped. He didn't want to invalidate Meghan. But he also didn't want to repeat mistakes he's made before. Mistakes that cost him relationships, reputation, and peace. He's lived through public fallout. He knows how brutal it can be. And he knows that once a narrative forms, it's almost impossible to control. That's why he wanted to stop it early. But Meghan didn't see prevention. She saw surrender. That difference set the tone for everything that followed. In the days after Sundance, Harry became noticeably quieter in public appearances, less reactive, less expressive, less present. Observers chalked it up to exhaustion, but those close to him knew better. He was processing. Because for Harry, this incident resurfaced a question he's been avoiding for a long time. What happens when your partner's battles start costing you more than they're worth? That question is dangerous. It doesn't lead to immediate answers, it leads to doubt. And doubt is corrosive. Harry didn't voice that doubt openly, but he felt it, and Meghan sensed it. Which brings us to the deeper fracture. This wasn't just about Sundance. It was about direction. Harry wants stability, normalcy, a quieter life. Meghan wants influence, recognition, leverage. Those goals are not incompatible, until they are. And Sundance may have been the first moment where the cost of chasing influence outweighed the benefit, at least in Harry's mind. That realization made him pull back, and pulling back, even slightly, changes everything. Because when one partner stops charging forward, the other feels alone. Meghan didn't want empathy. She wanted alignment. And alignment was no longer guaranteed. This is why the incident lingered. Why it didn't resolve with time. Why it resurfaced in conversations, silences, decisions. Harry's internal conflict didn't disappear after Sundance. It deepened. Because the more he thought about it, the more he realized something unsettling. He didn't miss the title. He didn't need it. And that realization created a gap between him and Meghan that no amount of hand-holding could bridge. By the time they returned home, the narrative had already shifted publicly, but privately, something else was happening. Harry was reconsidering. Not the marriage, not the partnership, the strategy, and when strategies diverge, so do paths. The next chapter explores what happens when identity and ambition collide, and why Meghan's attachment to the title revealed far more than anyone expected. Because the obsession with being called Duchess, it was about something much deeper. Something that had been shaping her decisions for years. And once that becomes clear, everything else starts to make sense. She says the title doesn't matter. That's the line. It's been repeated in interviews, echoed by supporters, written into talking points, a reassurance meant to quiet critics and disarm skeptics. The title doesn't matter, but Sundance proved something else entirely. Because when the word Duchess disappeared, so did the illusion that it was optional. Chapter 6 begins with that contradiction, the one no amount of branding can smooth over. If the title truly didn't matter, its absence wouldn't have triggered fury. If it was just a word, it wouldn't have overshadowed a film premiere. If it was symbolic only, Meghan Markle wouldn't have fought so hard to protect it. So why does it still matter? To answer that, you have to strip away the public narrative and look at what the title actually represents to Meghan, not historically, but psychologically. The title is not about monarchy, it's about legitimacy. When Meghan married into the royal family, the title did something nothing else could. It transformed her overnight, actress to duchess, outsider to insider, interview, subject to global figure. That shift wasn't just ceremonial, it was validating. For the first time, Meghan wasn't asking to be taken seriously. She was declared serious by an institution older than Hollywood itself. That kind of validation rewires identity, and when you later reject the institution but keep the title, you're not being inconsistent. You're being selective. You're keeping the part that worked. This is where the emotional complexity deepens. Meghan didn't just lose a job when she stepped back from royal duties. She lost a structure that told the world how to see her. And when structures disappear, people cling to symbols. The title became that symbol, not because she needed it to feel important, but because it anchored her authority in spaces that might otherwise question it. Hollywood is one of those spaces. In Hollywood, credentials are constantly challenged, fame is temporary, influence fluctuates, and respect must be re-earned in every room. The title cuts through that uncertainty. It signals elevation without explanation. And that's why Sundance hurt, because Sundance stripped that signal away. Suddenly, Meghan was just another high-profile figure asking to be taken seriously, without the institutional backing that once guaranteed it. That's uncomfortable, especially for someone who has spent years building a brand around being underestimated, dismissed, and misunderstood. The irony is painful. Meghan's story has always been about not being seen, and yet, when she was finally seen without the title, it felt like erasure. That tension sits at the heart of her attachment to Duchess. It's not about deference, it's about protection. Protection from being reduced. Protection from being questioned. Protection from being treated like everyone else. Equality sounds noble in theory, but in practice, equality removes armor. And Meghan's armor has always been narrative control. Here's where things get uncomfortable for her supporters. Because the insistence on the title undermines the very message she claims to champion. You can't dismantle hierarchy while insisting on being elevated by it. You can't argue for equality while demanding exemption. And Hollywood noticed that contradiction long before Sundance. Industry insiders say the title has been a quiet sticking point for years, sometimes honored, sometimes ignored, sometimes awkwardly avoided, but Sundance made it unavoidable. Because Sundance doesn't operate on politeness. It operates on principle, and principle doesn't negotiate with branding. Meghan's insistence on the title revealed something deeper than pride. It revealed fear. Fear of becoming ordinary. Fear of losing leverage. Fear of being evaluated purely on output rather than symbolism. That fear is not irrational. Hollywood can be brutal. It discards people quickly, especially women who challenge power structures with